Hi, I'm Reid Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. It warms my heart to know that you're here listening today, for you see, Grief Refuge isn't your typical Talk About Grief podcast. If this is your first time listening, welcome. Grief Refuge is about helping you find peace and purpose after loss. This podcast is about validating your grief-related thoughts and your grief-related feelings, taking time to reflect, and honoring self-care that helps you heal. Here at Grief Refuge, you will learn healthy ways to manage grief. You will also find comfort, hope, and a sense of peace in regards to your loss and your life moving one step forward at a time. Through the stories and conversations shared on this podcast, my intention is to provide companionship, insight, and a soothing voice to help you navigate the heavier, more painful feelings that go hand in hand with grief. Grief is hard, and grief is painful. I'm glad you're here, and I promise to do everything I can to provide the best support to you. Before we begin, let's go over a little housekeeping. Because of the depth and the nature of this topic, it may be more beneficial to not multitask while listening. Rather than keeping busy, I invite you to use this time for self-care and personal reflection. Use this time to soften and to relax and allow your grief-related feelings to run their course. Use this time to mourn your loss. Also, this podcast publishes episodes twice a month. When you're grieving, that's a lot of time in between each episode. If you need more support, download the Grief Refuge app. The Grief Refuge app delivers messages of grief-related validation, hope, and comfort every day. And it's all intended to help soothe and comfort you throughout this difficult journey. You can download the Grief Refuge app for free from the App Store that's sitting on your smartphone. Thank you, and let's move on to today's topic. Even though everyone's grief journey is unique, there are still expectations and preconceived notions for how someone is supposed to grieve. How can I be strong? Am I grieving right? Is it okay to feel this way? These are some of the things that men, as widowed fathers, can think and feel throughout their grief journeys. Today I welcome Dr. Justin Yopp, a psychologist and member of the UNC Comprehensive Cancer Support Program at the North Carolina Cancer Hospital. Justin and I shared a conversation with about some of the stereotypes, emotions, and approaches to grieving that men as widowed fathers endure. I found our conversation to be insightful, informative, and deeply helpful. There is strength in vulnerability, and as two men in this profession of grief support and mental health, Justin and I greatly appreciate your time and your attention to this important topic. Hey there, everyone. I'm here with Dr. Justin Yopp, and we're here to talk about something that I think is really important in the grieving space. And it happens to do with a lot of men and how they grieve and how they get additional support. Justin, thanks so much for joining Grief Refuge today.
Absolutely, Reid. I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate you being here. I've listened to you speak on another podcast, and I just thought you're doing something really special and you're doing something really unique. And I really wanted to make sure that there was an opportunity to invite you on the Grief Refuge podcast and just share a little bit about your experience, a little bit about how you help people, and just help us gain a better understanding of, if we gender stereotype men, women getting support, we explore a little bit about how men function, for lack of a better word, within support groups in your area. So can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do, Justin?
Yeah, so I'm a psychologist, and I actually work primarily at the UNC Cancer Hospital in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And the project that we'll be talking about today is one that my colleagues, Don Rosenstein and Lisa Park, and I started about 11 years ago. We had, unfortunately, several young mothers who died from cancer who we were seeing for counseling. And we got to thinking about their husbands soon after they died, and realized pretty quickly that there were just not any grief support groups specifically for fathers, right? So men who had lost a wife or a spouse or a partner and were raising kids on their own. And not really only was there not anything in our area, but best we could tell, there was not anything, at least organized or systematic, really anywhere in the whole country. And so, with that, Don and I decided to start a support group, and so we got together the three husbands of the women who had died, and were able to get a few other men who were in a similar situation, and started a support group. And we began with the idea that we would meet for 6 sessions, and that would be that. But that first group of men really changed our thinking in a lot of ways. And that first group ended up meeting for just about 4 years, that one support group, and really kind of put to bed, at least for us, any preconceived notions we had about men not being able to really kind of go there emotionally, or to connect with others around grief. And these men were incredible and inspired us to start a program. And so from that, we've continued to do support groups over the years and continue to do them now. We have a research agenda. Don and I wrote and published a book that was released a few years ago now. And really trying to kind of advance in this space on widowed fathers and now widowed mothers, but primarily our work has been with widowed fathers, who there's just not enough resources for in this world, and best we can tell, really, really need them, right? These are men who are simultaneously grieving the loss of their wife or their partner, are suddenly in charge of the household all on their own, and are trying to raise their children and help their children navigate their grief. And all those things are present on day one after losing their wife or partner. And just at the exact time that these men feel that they need to step up for their child, is the moment when they really just don't know that they have it in them. And so it just seemed 11 years ago, and it seems today, that this is a population that really, really needs some extra support.
Thanks for the introduction. There's a lot there. There's a lot that I'd love to explore. I guess I really want to start with my own preconceived notion, which is, it sounds like the three, going way back 11 years ago, the three men that had a common type of loss, were they clients in individual sessions? Is that how the introduction was made?
So their wives were the actual people who we were seeing in therapy as they were going through cancer. And that's, like I said, primarily what I do is meet with folks who have or are affected by cancer. And so we were meeting with his women and had come to know their husbands a little bit through our work with the women as they were navigating their illnesses. And then it so happened that they all died within a couple of weeks of each other. And that's really what impressed upon us, like, how about those husbands who we had come to know a little bit, but had certainly heard a lot about, and was forefront in the mind of the mothers as they knew that that their time was short, was, how is my husband going to do, and how are my kids going to do, and how are they going to do together as a family without me? And so that's what led us to really kind of dive into that. So these were not men who we were therapists for, and really got to know them almost solely after their wives had died.
So curious, what did it take for them to say yes to agree to do something like this to begin with?
Yeah, I think certainly with those men, we had a little bit of a step up, because we had connected with them some and certainly knew their wives. Getting some other guys in the group was a challenge, right? It ended up being some cold calls, and we really kind of cast a wide net throughout our hospital and throughout our community of anyone who fit the bill. And we certainly got more no's than we got yeses. And that's consistent with the research, right? Men in times of grief are less likely to receive support that is offered to them. and that certainly does kind of jive with some stereotypes that I imagine that we have, and that's been true, right? It was an uphill climb to get the first 7 guys in our group, and I don't remember exactly how many we asked, but it was probably about 20, and we got the 7. And the first night we met, man, it was rough sledding for the first 45 minutes. All the men, we asked them to introduce themselves and go around the room, and it was pretty clear that none of the guys actually wanted to be there, right? They were there either because they felt pressured or felt persuaded by a loved one, a sister, an aunt, someone that told them they needed to do this, or more often by feeling obliged to do it on their children's behalf, right? We had one guy in that first group say that if he was very suspect about his ability to be a solo parent. He said, if I'm going to be a crappy, solo parent, I might as well be the best crappy parent I can be. And so they really joined the group. Several of the men were explicit that they joined the group on behalf of their kids. And so that was kind of the ticket in the door. But once they came and once they got in there, after we got through that first night, which was, like I said, pretty rough, the men started to connect. By the end of that first night, they all came back for the second night and we were off. So our experience has been the real barrier is getting men kind of in the door. Once we get them in the door, once they come to that first session, it's not as if, we sit around for our groups and kind of twiddle our thumbs and it's awkward. I mean, these men, they get emotional. There's a lot of humor you might not expect in our group sessions. There's a lot of willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, right? About how they're doing and about, maybe some thoughts that they have and experiences they had that they really don't know they can share with other people. So once we get them in, man, these guys are off, and we don't have an agenda for our groups, right? It's not like Don and I come in and say, all right, guys, tonight we're going to focus on X, Y, and Z. We really put the responsibility on the fathers to bring to the table each meeting what feels pertinent and relevant to them. And, month after month, for year after year now, they do that. That's a kind of a long-winded answer, sorry, but really the challenge is getting men kind of in the door. But once they're in, and it may be somewhat of a selection bias, but once the men are there, the sessions, the group meetings themselves are in a way, very informative, riveting, and kind of nothing's off limits.
With your research component to your work, is there language or terminology for some of the reasons, research-wise, some of the reasons why men are a tough sell?
Well, I think it's, part of it comes back to, again, these kind of blanket stereotypes in our society that, probably not as entrenched as they were decades and decades ago, but are still there, right? And that's that men are to be strong and kind of the rock. And I think that's probably accentuated when you are now the only parent in the house, right? It's all on you. And the appearance or the acknowledgement that that you feel weak or vulnerable it kind of cuts against how a lot of us think men should be. And so acknowledging that, and Don and I were aware of that when we started our first group, and maybe we acquiesced too much because the first time the first group we kind of built it as I forget what it was called exactly, but it was the education and support group. Like, we even shied away from the support aspect, to be honest, because we thought some men may not respond to that, right? Like I need help. That's harder for men to say than it is for women to say, more often than not. And so I think that's kind of the biggest barrier is this idea that I have to be strong and I have to be strong for my family, and this notion that if I get in a support group, are we going to sit around, hold hands, and sing Kumbaya the whole time, and it's going to be all weird and touchy-feely, and they're going to have me burn incense or something. We've had some fathers kind of joke about their expectations, and that led them to be have some trepidation coming in. It's certainly not like that at all. But yeah, look, getting in front of a group of guys who you don't otherwise know and talking about the thing that has rocked your world like no other and left you dazed and confused and unsure of yourself and your parenting, that takes some willingness to be vulnerable. And I think that's just harder for more guys than it is for women.
Okay. Thanks, Justin. Well, I tell you what, it's funny, earlier in our conversation, you mentioned the word step up, and I wrote down a little note about strength to ask you about men and feeling like they need to be strong. And I was so curious, like, I think I have my assumptions of what that means as far as me identifying as a man and my role, culture I grew up in, et cetera. But within your area and within the people that you serve and the support groups that you provide, I'm very curious if you can help express some terminology as far as when someone first comes and they say, you hear some of those things of like, yeah, I thought I just needed to be strong for my kids. I need to be strong for the rest of my family. Are there a couple of examples you can provide of how that's defined in this area?
Yeah, I think it's clarifying what the word strong means, right? I think being strong for your family means being as emotionally present as you can during your grief. Having your focus on your kids and kind of getting from one day to the next. Strong does not mean being emotionally muted or being, that you have to be kind of the Superman and the Rock, and you're not allowed to have bad days or bad weeks or bad months. That's not what strong means. I mean, each of these guys, you could certainly, and the women in our group too, you could characterize as being strong, because how can you not be, right? You just experienced the greatest loss of your life. You're now pretty much solely responsible for leading a household and helping your children grieve. And, you're getting through day to day, and you're making all kinds of, dropping all kinds of balls, but that's not being strong. Right. And even the word strong, I think we kind of shy away from that, because that implies that there's a weak, right? That if you're being strong, then that means that there was an option for you to be weak. And I don't know that that's the most kind of helpful language. So I think we kind of go with, look, you are being strong, if that's helpful for you to look at it that way, but we don't try to amplify that language, because like I said, that implies that if you weren't being a certain way, then you would be weak. And that's just not accurate or helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we really, I think, have a culture in our groups where we promote kind of self-forgiveness and giving grace to yourself and others, and treating yourself like you would treat someone else, right? I mean, a lot of us tend to be harder on ourselves than would other people, but crying, becoming emotional in all kinds of ways. I mean, that, if you weren't having those times, you probably wouldn't feel great about that either, right? I mean, you probably think, what the hell's wrong with me? Why am I not upset? So it's really easy, I think, for these guys to box themselves into thinking I have to be a certain way. Mm-hmm. And kind of what's the kind of way to thread the needle about the ideal way to grieve. I mean, that's just not a helpful construct to look at it, right? So I think we kind of promote this idea of giving yourself a little bit of grace, if not a lot of grace. There's a lot of different ways to grieve, and 99% of it is in the quote unquote normal range. I think what we notice a lot is this sense of kind of, and I don't think this is unique to men, but this constant kind of judging yourself on how you're grieving. Am I grieving right? Am I doing this right? Am I grieving? Am I too emotional? Am I not emotional enough? Am I, I feel a little bit of relief that my wife is not suffering anymore. Is that okay? Kind of this constant self-evaluation of, am I grieving right, or am I grieving appropriately? And that can lead to a lot of self-doubt and a lot of second guessing and feeling bad about yourself. And sometimes you just got to feel bad and not feel bad about feeling bad, right? Sometimes you just got to have a shitty day, and that's okay, even if you're a guy.
I think that's very well said. It's interesting. You brought up a little bit about some of the emotion that gets expressed. And one of my own assumptions or preconceived notions is that in a group setting, if a man is being observed or witnessed in his grieving process, he may likely lean towards anger as an emotional expression. And so, Justin, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about, now I know it's so unique. It obviously depends on the group. It depends on who's in the group. and it depends on when the group is had. But what is a safe emotion that is commonly expressed in the men's grief group support settings?
It's a good question, boy. And I hate to kind of say it runs the gamut because that's not much of an answer. But we see a lot of anger, and sometimes that anger can come out in different ways, right? I mean, there's anger about, you know, in most cases, anger that their wives or their partners were taken from them such an early age. Anger for their kids that they're not going to have a mom. Anger at their own situation, that this is not how they envisioned their life is unfolding, and now they're having to readjust completely. And there's a sense of it's not fair, and of course everyone knows life's not fair, but I think a lot of us kind of have the thought that it should be more or less, or and so I think there's a lot of anger, and I think it's just to focus on that one emotion. And what comes up a lot in our groups is how does that anger and where is that anger directed at, right? It can be directed at coworkers. It can be directed at God. It can be directed at people who come up to you and mean well but say the exact wrong thing at the exact wrong time about God needed another angel or that kind of stuff, right? I mean, and I think one thing that we see pretty frequently is that the men help each other with that, help each other recognize, certainly some things are worth being angry about, but what's the real fuel? What are you really angry about? Certainly it can come out in all different kinds of ways, but what's the kind of bottom line? And that's, I think, for a lot of guys, just what you think it would be, right? Anger that this tragedy has befallen them and their child and their wife, and it just sucks. And so anger is certainly expressed, not, I don't know that in our group there's a whole lot of kind of outburst of anger, but a lot of talking about feeling angry and describing instances when they feel angry. And that's, I'm not going to get on a bandwagon here about models of grief, but some of our guys come into it thinking, kind of adhering to the 5 stages of grief, right? Kind of this depression, anger, bargaining, I forget them all, denial. And we almost always make a point of disabusing people of those kind of notions, that somehow grief is 1, orderly, 2, kind of subscribe to 5 different feelings. Grief's a hell of a lot more than that, right? And so I'm trying not to get on the tangent, but I'm trying hard, because I think that shapes how a lot of guys think. We had one guy come in and said, I think I'm in my angry phase, but it doesn't make sense because I'm also feeling a little relieved that my wife's not suffering, and I'm also really regretful that I didn't do this, that, and the other, and that doesn't fit into the stages of grief. And we're like, yeah, you got to get that model out of your mind. That's got nothing to do with anything. That was developed in the 60s anyway. So I think it's a lot of not grief education, but that the list of emotions that come with are associated with grief are as long as you can name emotions, right? And I think that it's really easy to get, and especially for guys, to kind of get in a silo about that, where you don't talk about it, you don't bounce it off people, and so you're left to your own thoughts, and it can be kind of hard to figure things out if you're not expressing them, either writing them down in a diary or expressing them verbally with other people. And I think that's one of the real values of the group, is that it gets these guys out of the tendency to be in your silo and grieve alone. And I'm got a long-winded in my answer, but I think that is one of a couple of the key ingredients of what has made this group so successful over
thanks,
11 years.
Often with everyone I work with in this grief support space, it's interesting. I feel like you mentioned the silo metaphor or analogy, and it's like a lot of people, they look to something as a model, something that they can take their grief and put it into this box. Grief is supposed to be this way, and if I'm not doing it this way, like you said earlier, there's some self-judgment, but then that leads towards a bit of that silo. It's like, okay, well, I'm not being seen for the grief that I'm experiencing, and I don't feel good about it. So I'm going to enter my silo over here. I'm going to isolate a little bit more. And perhaps it may be a little bit, quote unquote, easier for me to grieve this way. And it's such an irony. It's a sad irony I see, because to me, it just kind of seems like it contributes to a bit more pain, a bit more hurt, a bit more loneliness.
Yeah, I think you said that well. I think you're exactly right. And that's something that men do more of than women. There's research to bear that out, right? Like we said, men are less likely to ask for help or connect with others around grief, and less likely to receive help and support when it's offered to them. So they, again, broad brush, but by nature are more likely to silo. And I can't tell you how many times in our group meetings one father will say something that's a little bit, kind of an uncomfortable truth, that they feel a certain way, or that they've had this experience and they haven't really told anyone, but this seems like a safe place. And so they say it. And then you just see heads like nod around the table. And it's a little bit of like, oh my God, you too, like, it's not just me. And so that, and I think that comes from the silo, right? That you keep it in, and you are judging your grief, evaluating your grief based on what? These guys aren't grief experts, right? This is their first time doing this. So they're kind of basing it on whatever they hear about some old outdated model, or however they kind of saw someone in their family go through grief years ago, right? You just don't know how to judge it. You don't know how to stay in the lane, or where even the markers and boundaries are. So you just feel lost. But without connecting with other people, it's hard to feel found. And I think that is the real value of these groups, right? It's realizing that it's not just you, not just in the sense of, I'm not the only person grieving the loss of my 38-year-old spouse with kids at home, but I'm not the only one who's feels like I'm doing okay, and then a song comes on the radio or a thought crosses my mind and I'm in a puddle, right? Like, that's not just me. I'm not screwed up. Oh, okay, good. Or it's not just me that kind of can't shake the thought of the day or days leading up to my wife dying. Or it's not just me who sometimes feels a little bit of relief that not only is my wife not suffering from cancer anymore, but I don't have to watch her suffer, right? And these kind of things are hard to say to people who you feel like don't get it, right? It's hard to tell that to someone who is divorced with kids and kind of thinks they're in the same boat. Well, not really. Or it's hard to say to someone, who maybe is grieving the loss of a 50-year marriage and is older. Certainly grief is the same in a lot of ways, but it's different in others. And so getting these men together, and that's really why, like I said, that's why we put the responsibility on the men to bring up what's important. And sometimes it takes a little bit of getting comfortable with the group before they are open to disclosing these kind of things. But when they do, I think that's when the magic happens. That's when you feel the connection between them, and this kind of relief of like, okay, it's not just me, and I'm not screwed up. I'm just grieving.
Well said. Yeah, I was so curious about if there are moments where you see some of that, what you referred to as magic, and I was going to call it transformation. Mm-hmm. You get me thinking about putting myself in their shoes, where it's like, okay, I just lost, someone really special, my intimate partner, and now I have to be a father too. And so I was really wondering, in these unique group settings, is a lot of that connection, like, because I assume it's verbally talked about, and so is a lot of that connection through what's shared about their own grief in losing their partner, or also like grieving and being a dad? Like, what's kind of that balance there?
That's a great question, and it really toggles back and forth within the same. We had a group meeting last night, and off the top of my head, I could think of several instances where we talked about both, right? Grieving their loss of their life partner, and trying to figure out how to help their kids. One guy doesn't know whether he should tell his kids' school counselors, or kind of how to kids are making like Christmas cards for their family, and his is a little different. And so it's this, it's this kind of grief plus, right? You're not just grieving your loss, but you're helping the person, people you're now responsible for raising on your own, navigate and grieve their losses. And it's something that we've seen, especially with these men who are, relatively young. Is not, so much of, we think about grief as kind of grieving what has been lost in the past. But boy, so much of it, I think for these guys in particular, is grieving the future, right? Grieving the future that's not going to play out like they had expected or assumed. And grieving that, and that really sneaks up in all kinds of ways, right? We had one guy tell us that he was at a wedding maybe 6 months after his wife died. And that was kind of hard for him to go to, but he went, and he was doing okay. And then during the reception, the DJ, whoever played that game, where like everyone who's a couple out on the dance floor, and then he would call off years, and however long you've been married, if you've been married that long, then exit the dance floor, and whoever's been married the longest stays on the dance floor. So he said, he was going through numbers 5, 10, 15, and he realized that he was married to his wife for 14 years, and that was it. That number was frozen. He would never reach 15 or 20. He would never be that couple out on the dance floor. And so it's not just grieving what was lost, it's grieving what will never be, grieving that his wife wouldn't be at their child's graduation or their wedding, or just everyday moments of Friday night movie night on the couch. And so this idea of grieving a future that is lost is as palpable as grieving a past that has been lost.
I think that's very insightful and very well articulated. I so appreciate you saying that, Justin. It is important to understand that it's not just loss in what we had, but also loss in what we always wanted to have. That's a beautiful articulation. Well, I tell you what, this has been a fantastic conversation. I feel like we should probably reconnect in the future and have you back on again, talk even a little bit more deeper or something more research-based, because I'm sure you do some great research. Just one last question for you, Justin. It takes a special person to do this kind of work. And one, I thank you for showing up for the people who need the extra support. But my question is, what keeps you going?
That's another good question. I think what helps me, and look, there's no doubt that, these groups impact me and, and Don and everyone else who leads these. I mean, how can it not? And I'm especially when I started this, my wife and I had 2 relatively young kids, and it didn't take a whole lot of imagination for me to put myself in the shoes, that these men were in. And so I'm not going to discount the emotional impact. At the same time, I think what helps me is thinking, these guys are grieving and working their way through the most challenging, arduous times of their life. Me being present and being available to them isn't, that's has nothing to do with them grieving, right? They're grieving regardless. And either my choice is either to kind of help with that and be present with people with that, or not. And so in that way, I kind of see it as as not to be, I think it's an honor, right? I mean, that these guys allow me to be witness to and be a partner with their grief and their healing. And I think we're doing some good, and knowing that and being aware of that, and having the guys tell us that really helps to offset, the times where we kind of end the night and have to catch our own breaths. And at the same time, I will say, I said this earlier, there's a lot of humor in these groups, right? I mean, there's a lot of sadness and emotional moments, but that really helps. It helps. They don't do it for me, but it helps me because I think there's a lot more humor and laughter than people would ever expect in a grief support group. And I think that's because these guys can joke about stuff with each other that they can't joke about with other people. And that if other people made it, kind of found some humor or some in their situation, it wouldn't be funny. It's only funny if it's coming from within your community. And and so that helps. There is, if you were just a fly on the wall watching, Don and I lead these groups, I mean, you would see that there are times that we feel emotional, but you would see us laugh a lot too. And so it's not, these groups are just as often invigorating to me and to Don as they are kind of emotionally heavy, and more than often both.
Awesome. I really appreciate that. Well, Justin, thanks for giving us a little more insight into your world and the work you do and how you show up to helping people, men, and it sounds like women too, grieve in their own unique ways. Thanks for being a part of Grief Refuge, Justin.
Well, Reid, I really appreciate you having us on and highlighting our program and the work we do. And I really like and value your podcast and all that you're doing for others. So thanks for having me on. I would love to come back and maybe bring Don and Lisa, who really leads up our research program. She can tell you more research language about what we're doing and where we're heading with that aspect of our program.
Thank you so much for listening to the full interview. I'm deeply grateful for your trust in Grief Refuge and our mission. We help the grieving find peace and purpose after loss. This is important work, and although painful at times, it is worth your time and it's worth your attention to help heal your heart, your mind, and your soul. You can get more stories, guidance, insights, and more grief support on the Grief Refuge app, which I hope you download from your phone's app store now. Thank you, take care, keep honoring your grief journey, be kind to yourself, and talk to you soon.